Okay, everybody, welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation here in Waltham, Massachusetts. We are currently in the main gallery taking a look at this great signpost that was built by a longtime volunteer here, Kurt Hayashi, and it includes on it a sign directing us to the W.H Nichols Company, which was a little less than a mile from here over on Ward Avenue near the Waltham Watch Factory. If any of you are familiar with downtown Waltham, you would know where the Waltham Watch Factory is. I'm going to flip the camera around here, if I can figure out how to do that, and take you over to what is a great place to start. Somebody prepping me for today said, hey, if you want to deal with your nervousness and lighten things up a little bit, wear a funny hat. Well, I've put this hat on now for the second time in a live video, but this time it's for a reason. Today's virtual visit is going to focus on the W.H Nichols Company and Factory. We have a gallery that's named after the Nichols Company. And one of the things that the W.H Nichols Company did was start a museum of their own that was located at their factory over on Ward Avenue, less than a mile from here. And one of the artifacts that they acquired was Engine 1, Waltham's first fire engine. It was a steam engine built by the Amoskeag Company up in New Hampshire, and it was really quite a marvelous machine, and W.H. Nichols acquired it and put it into the museum's, the Nichols Museum's collection. So W.H. purchased it in 1950 from the city of Waltham for $150. The fire engine had been retired and it was going to be scrapped, but W.H. decided that it ought to be saved, and that made it one of the prized artifacts in their exhibit. So standing here in the main gallery with Engine 1 to our left, if we turn facing west, you'll see the W.H. Nichols Company sign and their address at 48 Ward Ave. And let's enter. This is going to be a bit of an exploration of the exhibit, but also we will be talking about some of the people in the family and some of their achievements, both as workers in the company, but also in their personal lives. We have audio, but echoing. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We'll work these out. What I wanted to say is this is our first time ever using Zoom in one of these presentations. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do this smoothly from this point forward. I've closed here. So W.H. Nichols, born in Ontario, learned early on that he had a technical gift and started to design and build bicycles, and he actually set a world record in a bicycle race in Montreal. But eventually knew that he had to get out of Dodge, as it were, and he moved to Connecticut and got a job with Pratt & Whitney in Hartford. And it was in Connecticut that he met and married his wife, Louise Bell Stoddard, and they eventually moved to Waltham, and the first business that W.H. established in Waltham was actually a bicycle business, and it didn't work very well, so he moved it a couple of times, but then he started making parts for watch companies in the Waltham area, of course, chief among them, the Waltham Watch Company, world famous, but he also started taking on jobs for others, and he gradually developed a reputation and a nickname as Accurate Nichols. He was extraordinarily gifted at taking other people's designs that were too difficult for the inventors or developers to build themselves, and he was able to develop a technical he had the technical skills to be able to take someone's invention that had very high tolerances and bring them into production. He was a guy who had very high standards, and he had a saying that was posted in the factory where it said that everything almost right, or anything almost right, is wrong. So W.H and Louise had 5 kids. Of course, a William Hart Nichols Sr., so another W.H. Nichols, A.A. Nichols or Arthur Nichols, Merwin Roswell Nichols, Francis Wilman Nichols, and Barbara Bell Nichols. And each of them had very interesting stories all their own. Unfortunately, Merwin died at a very young age. But Hart Nichols and Arthur Nichols did go on to become great makers themselves, and ended up together working in and running the W.H Nichols Company, following in their father's footsteps. And one of the great stories that I find utterly fascinating is Barbara Bell Nichols. She in England met a German journalist named Wolfgang Strada, and they were married in Waltham in 1939. And in 1941, they sailed for London aboard a German flagged ship. And while at sea, war was declared with Germany, and they had no choice but to disembark in Wolfgang's homeland in Germany, and that's where they stayed for the duration of World War II. As told to me, he, as a journalist, was very much a, he did something he shouldn't have done. He took a huge risk, and he had heard that the Allies had landed at Normandy. He broadcast that, and he was, the SS went and arrested him, and Barbara had to flee. And my understanding is that she did so on a bicycle and rode as far and as fast as she could west. And she ended up by the side of a river, and she heard voices across the river, and they were speaking English. And it turns out it was an American Army company. And she got their attention across the river, and a conversation ensued, and she identified herself. And she said that she had lived in Waltham, or she was from Waltham, Massachusetts. And it turned out that the leader of that company or battalion was also from Waltham, Massachusetts. And he, in order for her to prove her identity, he asked her some very specific questions about the geography or landmarks in Waltham, and she knew the answers. And so the U.S. Army group sent a boat across the river, picked her up, and brought her into the group, essentially rescuing her. And she could have gone back to the United States at that point, but she elected to actually stay with the Army, and worked as an interpreter for I think the duration of the war, which didn't have all that long to go. Unfortunately, she did lose her husband. Wolfgang Strada was ultimately captured by the Russians and died in a Russian prison camp. But that is one of the sort of peripheral stories if you're looking at this exhibit with the company first. But we think of this exhibit as really being about a company and their amazing achievements, but also a company that had an ethic that really cared about people, and a family that really had a great deal of talent in lots of ways and pursued some unique and very personal futures. So Accurate Nichols was famous for being able to take someone else's design, figure out a production process for that design that produced high volume and high quality. And there are some examples of that work in a case that we have over here. Probably the most famous product was the Giroud ER. Now, the Giroud ER is a really interesting, complex two-part pump, essentially, where it's got sort of, if you look at these, you can see that they've got an internal gear and an external gear. And the internal gear has one less tooth, and the external gear that's inverted has indentations. And as the Giroud ER, as the centerpiece turns, you can take a look at this. This one works more easily. Set this up here and manipulate it. So it's really quite fascinating. Which one works better? So you can sort of see it would move fluid from one chamber to the next. And it's a pretty interesting and complex design that W.H. Nichols and his company figured out how to manufacture. And the amazing thing is, even though the W.H. Nichols Company closed in 1985, they were acquired by Parker Hannifin, a much larger company, and Parker Hannifin is still operating a company in Portland, Maine called Nichols Portland. But the Giroud ER was a crucial product for the Nichols Company, and it really permeated their entire lives. Louise Botero, Louise Nichols Botero, who's a grandchild of W.H. Nichols, is a fantastic quilter. And if you want to get a feel for just how deeply their commitment to Giroud ERs, or how important Giroud ERs were to the family, you can see them here in this quilt. Barbara Nichols, so she was the woman who had married the German journalist. This print is a beautiful piece that she had made, and actually had been, she'd taken a printmaking class at the Cordova Museum, and you can see just how talented she is, but you can also see here are Giroud ERs and how they figured into the family art, not just the family business. Another product that the Nichols Company was famous for was this anti-icer pump, and this turned out to be a critical part in the manufacture of the B-29 bomber in World War II. Those bombers flew at very high altitudes, and engines tended to ice at that altitude, and the Nichols Company figured out how to produce a pump that would not ice, and those were critically important. Speaking of World War II and sort of how I'm going to work around the room a little bit randomly, the US government, for excellence in manufacturing, would give what they called E awards, the Army Navy E award for high achievement in the production of war equipment. And to receive one of those awards was a very high honor. And this is a great photograph of WH receiving an E award in Waltham from a military official. And the amazing thing is that the Nichols Company didn't receive one E award. They actually earned 5 during the course of World War II, which was a very rare achievement. I think the most any company was ever awarded was 6, and the Nichols Company earned 5. So you see me keep circling this amazing black vehicle. What is this black vehicle? Well, it's always been known affectionately by the family as the Bug. So back in the 1920s, W.H.'s two sons that really showed great technical aptitude and interest went to their dad and said, you know, Dad, we'd like cars. And he said, well, I mean, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, that's great, boys. You can have cars, but if you're going to get them, you're going to have to build them yourselves. And they did. So Hart and Arthur built their own cars. And so it was Hart who built this car, which does not survive. And I don't know if it had a nickname, but Arthur's does survive to this day. It dates from 1925 and it's called the Bug. And it's got a lot of extraordinary details. For one thing, it's got a 2x4 frame. It's got a Ford Model T engine, but they did a funny thing with this engine. They reverse mounted it. And by reverse mounting this Ford Model T engine, they sent the drive shaft forward rather than toward the rear wheels. And that led to the necessity to devise and build a front wheel drive system. So you can see the front differential here on the between the headlights. And my understanding is this was the first front wheel drive car in the United States. You can quote me on that, but I could be wrong. I think there were some front wheel drive vehicles in Europe at the time, but nothing in the US. And this truly was one of a kind. One of the things I enjoy most about this car is the fact that the front wheel drive shaft going through the front of the car meant that they could not use an ordinary automobile radiator. Remember that this is kind of you know, use existing parts wherever you can and fabricate what you can't. Well, they ended up using an old Italian airplane radiator because an airplane radiator at that time for a single engine plane would have a propeller shaft going out the front of the plane. And that worked really well in this particular case. This is the trunk. The car has half of an old Mack truck windshield as its windshield. I believe this is an old horse buggy seat, but I'm not 100% sure about that. You can see the bicycle pump here in front of the spare. Coming around to this side of the car, this is another view of the Model T engine, reverse mounted. And right here's the fuel tank, and here's the fuel fill. So you've got the fuel tank right next to the engine. I guess that explains why they put a fire extinguisher on the dashboard. Very simple gauge cluster. And a similar set of pedals to the Model T. Beautiful wooden steering wheel. My understanding is this car could do about 40 miles an hour and that it still runs, although its carburetor had been removed for service when it was when the vehicle was lent to the museum. And it's on long-term loan to us. And so that is a very precious artifact within the family, but it also is a great statement or testament to the technical skill of the Nichols family. They could design and build their own vehicles. I mean, can you imagine people doing that today? It's certainly an uncommon thing, and it's really a thing of beauty. I mean, imagine it's 95 years old and the thing still runs. Built about a mile from here. something else related to World War II that I didn't want to forget to tell you was the story of Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle, you might remember him if you have a sense of World War II history. Let me flip the camera around. He was a highly decorated, skilled American bomber pilot in World War II. Well, he and W.H. Nichols were good friends. And there was a time when he visited the family in this area, and the story has it that he flew down the Charles River toward Boston and flew underneath some of the bridges over the Charles. And that did not go over very well with the Boston police, who hunted him down and asked him not to do it again and to never come back. But apparently he was not arrested because he was who he was. But can you imagine witnessing that? Can you imagine the skill necessary to pull that off? And anyway, it sure gives us a great story to tell as time goes by. W.H. Nichols was a great model maker. You can see a couple of examples of his model making capability here. One of them is this model of the White Swan. The White Swan was a launch that a life-size version was made of, and they were reusing the name of a steamboat that you can see in this picture on the lower left that used to patrol the Charles River from Moody Street to Auburndale and back again back in the 1870s. Well, W.H. Nichols built a launch that they called the White Swan back in the 1940s. And there's a beautiful model of the White Swan. But earlier than that, W.H. built the Louise B. And the Louise B is, of course, after Louise Bell Stoddard, his wife. And this is actually a working steamboat, believe it or not. And he was an early live steam hobbyist. He didn't just do steamboats, but he did steam locomotives. And there is a steam locomotive that is legend in the family and around New England, frankly, in the live steam community. There is a live steam community that builds and runs live steam engines. We have a good exhibit of some beautiful live steam locomotives here that are not Nichols locomotives. But W.H., I don't know how many more than this one he built, but he built one that, in a play on words, he called Ella Cinders rather than Cinderella. And this is Ella Cinders. And Ella Cinders was legend in Waltham because W.H. would invite people in the community to come over and ride Ella. He had installed track around the family home, which was also adjacent to the company, the W.H. Nichols factory. And he was famous for giving kids rides on Ella Cinders. And this is a 1932 newsreel. That's W.H. himself with neighborhood kids on Ella Cinders. Can you imagine the fun? And there you can see the sawtooth roof of the original factory and the family home. There's the stenciled name. They even had a tunnel. I mean, how fun is that? W.H. Nichols Company didn't just make things like geroters and metering pumps and another part that they made that was really important was the first viable extruder for rayon. So in the very early days of synthetic thread, rayon was very early out of the gate, and the technique for extruding rayon had been conceived, but it wasn't possible. No one had figured out how to produce it well. Well, W.H. Nichols, Accurate Nichols, is the guy who did that. And so they were very famous for that as well. I'm just going to walk you over into our machine shop and show you the Nichols Miller. So if you look down here, clearly that's the company logo. And a deep embossing of the Nichols name on the milling machine. This one actually has a Bridgeport head on it. And if you are a machinist or know any machinists, you know Bridgeport, pretty much the gold standard. But Nichols mills were prized by machinists of their time. And it is one of the treasures in our machine shop, which is something you ought to visit when you come to the museum. Why I like telling that little anecdote is the building that we occupy was the Boston Manufacturing Company, and the Boston Manufacturing Company's machinist was Paul Moody. And Moody became famous over time because he didn't just establish the Boston Manufacturing Company machine shop, but he also did for the Merrimack Manufacturing Company up in Lowell, and he consulted, I believe, with Amoskeag. And this dates back to the early years of American manufacturing, where when you conceived an idea and you wanted to bring it into production, very often you needed not just to build your invention, but you often had to build the machines that were necessary to build your invention, necessary to build your parts, and then to assemble them. And deep into the 20th century, the W.H. Nichols Company is an example of designing and building a better way to run a machine shop. If you look at that video, and by the way, you can review that video on our website, you'll see that there are two passenger cars that link onto the back of it. Well, a gentleman named Chuck Leonard called me a couple of years ago, and he identified himself as being related to the Nichols family. And he has spent the last year or so lovingly installing track on his property that he shares with his wife, Jane Fogg. And he has also built a train barn to take Ella in. And so Ella is going to be retrieved from the museum at some point, perhaps this summer. I think that was the intent, but we'll see if COVID-19 is going to allow that. And Ella Cinders is going to be run again. And I believe that the track is family track. It might have even been track that was salvaged from the Ward Ave property. But that is an experience that I hope to have in my future, like those kids did back in that newsreel from 1932. Chuck's wife, Jane Fogg, is actually the first Nichols that I ever met. She and I were both sailing, racing sailboats against one another on Boston Harbor back in the late 1990s. We only learned. So we're going to take a look at this bike for a moment. It's a Peugeot. It's not an American bike, but it's W.H. Nichols's bike when he lived on Ward Ave, and he was known to take frequent bike rides most mornings, I believe, and on this bike and around Waltham, and he had lots of customary stops with grocers and so forth. And he was famous for being extremely friendly and chatting people up and so forth. Well, Jaime Botero, who is W.H.'s great grandson, lent this bike to the museum, and it's been on display here ever since. And he, in the fall of 2015, visited the museum and just wanted to see the bike again. And we ended up striking up a conversation with him. And the next time he visited, he brought in his mother and his daughter. And that sort of peeled back the many layers of the onion and got us to really understand who the W.H. Nichols Company and family really were. It is the W.H. Nichols Museum that really seeded a lot of the major pieces in our early collection. And so it's not just engine one over here, but I learned this morning actually, because Jaime, who lives in Colombia, called me this morning to talk a little bit about today. And it was he who informed me of something that I did not know, that this fun artifact was actually this switchboard, this telephone switchboard was on the factory floor, in the factory at the W.H. Nichols Company. And so this was part of the W.H. Nichols Museum that was donated to the Charles River Museum back in the mid-1980s when the company, the W.H. Nichols Company, was acquired by Parker Hannifin. I'm going to go see if I can make something a little bit unusual and fun happen. I tested this out this morning with kind of mixed results, but we have a gallery over here of steam engines, a really big one that used to run a small factory in Maine. And then we have this set of small model steam engines. And I hooked one up. I'll zoom in here on the plaque. So it was Jaime Botero, W.H.'s great-grandson, who had this made for him by his grandfather, who was Arthur Nichols. I hope I have that right. Was Arthur? Was it Hart? Darn it. It's hard to keep track because it was a big family, and I apologize to all the family members if I got it wrong. But we do run a, so this is a display that runs off compressed air, and I learned how to work this earlier today. And I am hoping that it's still got a little bit of pressure left in it. It does. So the question is, will this turn? And I don't think it's going to. I don't think that there's enough pressure. Oh yes, I had to turn this relief valve. And I wanted Jaime to see this engine actually working. You have to excuse me because I don't have the technical skills of our volunteers. There we go. Got a little bit. Come on, baby. Well, Jaime, I promise you it works. Dan Eyring took it apart, lubricated everything, put it back together a couple of years ago, and it was running quite well when properly driven. It may be that we don't have enough gas pressure, and I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but you can see that this model steam engine actually does run. Actually, I'm going to go back to the case here, where you can really appreciate the artistry of the family. This painting by Jane Nichols is a beautiful work made of her mother. So that is Louise B. And W.H. actually built this, and pretty much every child in the family for many generations would ride this around the house. It was kind of a rite of passage. It looks like an old steamroller. It's even got a bell on it. And the family gifted this to the museum a few years back. And it's a prized kid's toy. I'm going to take you back through here to show you a few more artifacts. My colleague Joe, I think you're following this, he is constantly mining eBay, and he came across this it's this beautiful airfoil. So another piece of precision machining by the W.H Nichols Company is this beautiful airfoil that he just acquired from eBay. And we don't know the backstory about it, but that is one gorgeous paperweight. He also came across this employee badge. Louise Botero and Jane Fogg visited the museum last fall and gifted us this beautiful painting. The Nichols Company was known as a fantastic place to work. They really appreciated their employees. They, in fact, legend has it that there were attempts by machinist unions to unionize the W.H Nichols Company, and the workers turned them down, saying that we have every right and privilege that you could possibly bargain for, and we are so happy working here. We really don't need you, the union, and plus we don't have to pay dues. So the W.H Nichols Company was actually never unionized, and it was a consequence of treating their employees right. And a Mr. Snow, a former employee of the W.H Nichols Company, another great artist in their circle, painted this beautiful picture and beautiful painting, and it actually is a perspective looking away from the factory onto the Charles River. And in the distance on the left, you can see I think it was a power plant or a water processing plant, a pumping station or something like that. You have to look through some old city maps to try and identify it. And the story that I was told is that this little dog was added at the very end. It was the family dog, and everybody in the factory knew this dog and loved this dog. And the artist, Mr. Snow, who painted it, felt that there was something missing from the painting. It needed something else, and he added the dog at the very end. It's very, very touching. I love it. It's an early picture of the bug. It's amazing to have this photograph from 1940 and then have the real deal here. And you wouldn't have known that all the metal work was red in a black and white photograph, would you? There's a picture of those Nichols boys, Hart and Arthur, and these early tiny little motorcycles that they built. Great photographic portrait of W.H. And I love this picture because it shows the family home and the factory with its sawtooth roof. Look at those old cars. And then it's another early picture of the bug. There's a picture of an older W.H. riding a penny farthing, one of those old high-wheeled bicycles. Boy, brave man, because those aren't easy to ride. And there's a classic portrait of the patriarch and the matriarch of the family. I was up in our library and I earlier today, and I came across this photo album that's got a lot of pictures of W.H. with Ella Cinders and kids. And he really was committed to community. He really was committed to this stage. Boy, she really glowed when she was polished. So this is kind of a scrapbook that W.H. must have kept of live steam, where he celebrates lots of people that were in that live steam community back in the day. The pool table story is a fun one. So back in the early 1900s, and I'm going to have to research this and pin it down, Gore Place, what's now known as Gore Place, which is the Christopher Gore estate that's on the Watertown Waltham line, had fallen on hard times. And in order to balance their books, they decided that they wanted to, they were going to auction off some of the contents of the home to raise money. I'll stick this down so that it doesn't jiggle while I talk. Maybe that'll be welcome. Anyway, so they had an auction at Gore Place, and one of the things that was auctioned off was the Gore Place pool table. And it was a big, beautiful billiard table, and WH purchased it at auction. And it got installed, I think, on the second floor of the factory, and it was something that they very much, the people at the factory very much enjoyed playing on and so forth. Well, at some point, many years later, the Gore Estate's finances were stabilized, and an effort, maybe a new leadership group was installed. And what they ended up doing was attempting to relocate and reacquire as many of the old original furnishings of the Gore Estate as they could possibly find. And it was known that the pool table was at the W.H Nichols Company. And so they went over to the, and visited WH and identified themselves and said, Mr. Nichols, we would very much like to purchase the pool table back from you. He flatly refused them. He said, no, you're not going to purchase the pool table. I'm not going to sell the pool table to you. So they, leave with their tails between their legs. And the next thing he did is he called down to his own shop. They always called the factory the shop, and scrambled a team to come up, disassemble the pool table, refinish it, buff it up, and reassembled it. And they put it on the company truck, and they drove it over to Gore Place and said, no, you absolutely cannot buy the pool table from us. We're going to give it to you. So if you go and visit Gore Place, there's a game room. I think it's on the second floor. I have seen that pool table several years back, and it is a thing of beauty. And that was part of W.H. Nichols's reputation. He was a very kind person and very community oriented. There's some other things around Waltham that Nichols was well known for. There actually are some stained glass windows in a church on Main Street. The large cobblestone church, I don't know if that is an architectural term, but the one, if you're looking at the post office from Main Street, it's the church on the left. And apparently there are stained glass windows that I have not seen. I walked around the exterior, and the windows themselves are very dark, but apparently the stained glass windows there have geroders in them. So the geroder didn't just make it into quilts, it didn't just make it into prints, but it also made it into some stained glass windows at a church in Waltham. And the other thing is there's a senior living home in Waltham called, I think it's called the Leland Center now, the Leland Home. And apparently that's where a lot of W.H. Nichols employees who after retirement, many of them ended up spending their last years at the Leland Home, and the Nichols Company was very generous in their support of the Leland Home at that time. The Nichols Company was famous for wanting balance in their lives. So the home and the factory were on the Charles River. They did a lot on the Charles River. They rode, they sailed. There's the white swan that you saw earlier. And there's a rowing scull. There's a photograph of action on the Charles River. They, of course, played baseball. They had holiday parties. There's W.H. Nichols blowing some sax. I mean, really, they were very much loved by the people that worked for them. Last thing I'll say is, you know, they're a family that that makes things. They make real things. They make things that work, and it's really very inspiring. I mean, they make steam engines that work. They make cars that you can drive. They make these beautiful models. They're artists, they're painters. I've had a good time sharing with you my appreciation for a great Waltham family and a great Waltham company. We will do more of these live visits in the future. Thank you very much for joining this one, and I'm hoping that you stay healthy and have a wonderful weekend. We'll talk to you soon.